When I tell my friends that I'm a therapist, a lot of them ask me like, oh, do you think in-person is better than virtual? Do you think virtual worth it? Hi, so today I wanted to talk about the difference between seeing clients in person and virtually, both from my experience as a client and also my experience as a therapist. Okay, so to begin, let's start with in person. So when I'm a client and I'm seeing my therapist in person, my experience is that I typically find it more intimate and a little bit like I'm connecting more with my therapist. And I really like this, especially in the beginning of a relationship with a therapist. I feel like it helps me like trust them more if I see them in person and I have a feel for what it's like what they're like in the real world 3D. But I've noticed that when I am a client, once my therapy has continued for some time, I can tell that my defenses are going up when I'm seeing my therapist in person, and I basically have a lot more introjects. And introjects is a Gestalt fancy word for saying I have stronger expectations and shoulds that I have for myself as a client when I'm seeing my therapist in person. Basically, I have an idea of like, oh, this is how a client should act, and this is what I should do, and this is what the therapist is expecting me to do. I have way more of that when I see my therapist in person, and I don't want that to be there because it kind of gets in the way of the work that I'm doing with them. So I've noticed that once I see my therapist for a while, I actually prefer virtual, but nonetheless, there are lots of good things that I've noticed, especially in the beginning with seeing my therapist in person. As a therapist, I noticed that I have a much easier time picking up on body cues, right? Yeah, body cues from my client, and just like generally having a better understanding of what the vibe is in the room. Sometimes I've noticed like in virtual sessions that it's a lot harder to tell what exactly is in the air. That I'm experiencing. Obviously, I don't actually know what the vibe is, but from my experience, it's easier for me to tell just the mood when I'm seeing a client in person. And then for virtually as a clinic, I've mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I find it more comforting to be in my room or in my home and have all of my things that I like around me when I'm seeing my therapist virtually. So for example, I'll have my soft blanket and I'm not worried that somebody else used the blanket. It's my blanket. I'll have my favorite cup of tea. And I just find that it helps me right now therapeutically to be able to have more physical distance from my therapist. So I'm actually working with my therapist right now with like turning off video, turning on video, and how that affects how I show up as a client. So right now it really works with me to see my therapist virtually. And then as a therapist, I've noticed that when I'm seeing my clients virtually, that I feel a little bit more at ease because I'm also at home and I can have all my comforting items like my blanket and my favorite tea and my plant that I can look at when I feel like not staring into my client's eyes. So I also feel at ease, but it is definitely harder for me to feel like the connection between me and my client because it's virtual. I've also definitely had instances where I'm having technical issues or things like the neighbor is really loud or I'm having a hard time hearing all those things. I have way more issues obviously when it's virtual because there's a possibility of technical issues, and that I feel like I hold that differently than when I'm seeing a client that's in person and there's construction and it's loud and it's hard to hear. I notice that it stresses me out way more when it's like a technical issue because I don't know what the other client is experiencing. I don't know what the client is experiencing. So yeah, that causes me definitely more stress when it's virtual. But basically, I wanted to talk about all of this because I tell my friends that I'm a therapist. A lot of them ask me like, oh, do you think in-person is better than virtual? Do you think virtual worth it? What's the difference? And I really think that it depends on the client and probably the therapist relationship, but most definitely on the client. Like, some questions that I would ask myself if I were to choose to see a therapist in person or virtual is, how am I showing up different when, for example, I'm seeing a friend in person? How is that different than if I'm seeing calling my friend? Like, is it easier for me to state my boundaries when I'm with them or when I'm not with them? Or, ask yourself, like, how do you show up differently when you're in the same space as somebody versus virtual? Because I think that will play a part in how the therapy is. Obviously, if you have experience working with therapists virtually and in person, reflect on how that made an impact on how you showed up as a client. But if you don't, then think about other relationships that you've had and see how that affects you. Okay, so hopefully you enjoy that video, and I'll see you later. Bye!